Right, thank you very much. The title of my presentation is Suicidal Drowning, and the article in Drowning itself was co-authored by myself and Finnish forensic pathologist Dr. Philippe Lunette. Suicide is deliberate, self-inflicted death. You cannot accidentally die by suicide, and you must die. The World Health Organization estimates that there are at least 1 million suicidal deaths annually, which is a 16 to 100,000 population ratio, and that for every person who dies, between 20 and 30 survive, which is called non-fatal self-harm. So you now have either fatal self-harm or non-fatal self-harm. It's estimated that 60% of all suicides in the world take place in Asia, which is not surprising since the majority of the world population live in Asia. And when it comes to collecting data or to mining suicide data, it is important to understand that suicide is illegal in some countries, and whereas in the majority of countries it is actually legal, it is frowned on socially, culturally, religiously, and just as we consider drowning to be a hidden pandemic, suicide is also a hidden pandemic. Suicide data that's published by the World Health Organization is normally, it comes in what are called ICD numbers, and this is ICD-10, which is the current, ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases, and ICD-10 is the 10th revision of it. And basically, when a person dies, a doctor fills in a form which basically gives the cause of the death, which means that most of the data that's recorded is actually inpatient, in-hospital data. There are thousands of ICD numbers, and this one is ICD, V9543 is for injury in a spacecraft collision. Or W5621 is injury received by being bitten by a killer whale. From our point of view, in relation to suicide, it comes under violent death. And this includes deaths by suicide, homicide, execution, or terrorism. In relation to suicide here, the number that we're dealing with is intentional self-harm, which is the codes between X60 and X84, and the one that deals specifically with suicide is code X71, suicide by drowning. Now there is another code which is important in relation to suicide, and it is Y21, which is drowning of undetermined intent. In other words, where a determination is definitely made that it is a suicide, then it's X71, but where it cannot be determined for certain that it is a suicide, then it's categorized in Y21 as drowning of undetermined intent. The actual number of suicide deaths then obviously is greater than X71 and is less than a combination of both of them. Now it's important to understand this distinction because sometimes in research papers the researcher will combine both together and they will give a guesstimate figure which is a combination of suicide by drowning and suicide of undetermined intent. But clearly all deaths where it cannot be determined that are suicide are not suicide, so the real figure is somewhere between this and the combination of suicide by drowning and suicide of undetermined intent. So is it a suicide or an accident? How is it determined made? As I said, my colleague Philippe Lunette, they did an analysis of 379 suicidal drownings in Finland and established that only 12% of the actual entries were witnessed. And of those who died, only 22% left a suicide note or, as is nowadays the practice, sent a text. So if you combine even both of those, it means that in 2 out of 3 cases, there was no way of clearly establishing whether or not the entry was intentional. In some countries, such as Ireland, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, there is a coronial system. In other words, the determination of the cause of death is made by a coroner with a jury. But in other countries, it's made, as in Finland, it's made by a pathologist. Now, Ireland and Finland have roughly the same population. But in Ireland, the decision is made by a coroner with a jury, whereas in Finland, the pathologist will make a determination. And the reason that this is important to understand is that where there is a coroner's jury, there is a greater likelihood of an undetermined verdict to be returned. Whereas a pathologist working alone with police is more likely to bring in a more definite suicide. So that if you were comparing suicide figures in Ireland with suicide figures in Finland, then there is a difference in determination. So, if you remember, I said that it's difficult to get suicide figures. If you think that it's difficult to establish drowning figures, then you will understand that when you take into account also the difficulty with suicide figures, that it is very, 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 very difficult to get anything like accurate figures in relation to suicide by drownings. Most of the time, we're dealing with best guess. Enough of figures. Let's move on to gender. There are gender differences, and it's basically more females self-harm, more males die by suicide. And the reason is that males tend to choose the violent means of killing themselves. They hang themselves, they shoot themselves, they jump off tall buildings. These are all methods of dying where changing your mind at the last minute is not much of an option. Whereas females tend to use poison, or they bloodlet, or drowning, was drowning, or in situations or cases where the actual length of time it takes to die creates a likelihood or a possibility of it being interrupted. And this is important. Just as we talk about interrupting the drowning process, very often it's important to interrupt also the suicide process, and this can be done. The final determinant is access to lethal means. In other words, person makes up their mind, I'm going to kill myself. How am I going to do it? If you're in America, you just go in to open a drawer, take out a gun, shoot yourself. Here are some common features of suicide by drowning. Usually they happen at night between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Usually the casualty is a male between 15 and 35, which is the same age range for an accidental one. Usually the person has been drinking alcohol beforehand, usually a lot. The person jumps into deep water, often from a bridge or a pier, and it's often at a weekend. Weekends are a particularly dangerous time. The rates of suicide by drowning range between 0.1 per 100,000 in the United States, which is 1 per million, to 0.9 per 100,000 in Northern Europe. Now, I already mentioned the US and guns, and I'll come back to that, but let's look at Ireland. Ireland is known to have a suicide problem, and it's also known to have a suicide by drowning problem. But Ireland is an island. The country is only approximately 300 miles long, 200 miles wide, but we have a coastline that's 3,500 miles. Right? And so almost all of our cities are on rivers. So you can see in Ireland, deep water is very it's close to hand, whereas in other places it's not. So, as I said, Ireland is an island with access to water, lots of it. So we have easy access to water, but also there's another reason why Ireland has a reputation. And it is that historically, going back since we published data, we've always included suicidal drowning figures in our published figures. We don't make a distinction, whereas most countries or most organizations, when they publish a national drowning report, you'll find a sentence somewhere in the beginning basically saying that this excludes suicides. So therefore, when you're making a comparison between suicide by drowning rates in one area or in one report and another, you have to ask yourself, first of all, is the report that's giving drowning figures inclusive or exclusive of suicides? If it's inclusive of suicide, does the country have a coronial system, or does a pathologist make a decision? Because these factors will change when you're making a comparison between A and B, often you're not comparing apples with apples, you're comparing apples with oranges. Let's look at suicide itself. Suicide is multifactorial. There are a number of key contributory factors, and the key ones are a person's mental health, drinking of alcohol, and a critical event which acts as a trigger, such as losing a job, being diagnosed with a serious illness, or a breakup of marriage. So it's usually a combination. In other words, it's seldom one single factor that leads to a suicide. Usually it's a combination of events, and again, once the decision has been made, there's access to lethal means. You saw in the last one that probably the lowest published suicide by drowning figures in the world are those for the United States, with 0.1 per 100,000 population. But in the United States, 20,000 people shoot themselves. Half of all those who die by suicide in the United States do so by guns. There are more suicides by shooting in the United States than there are homicides by shooting. So it's the ease of access. You don't have to go and find the nearest river when you can go and find the nearest gun. AWARE is an Irish depression support group, and very often in relation to mental health, it's assumed that, well, the person must be, they're paranoid, they're schizophrenic, they're manic depressive. They're not. Most people who die by suicide are suffering from depression, and it's not serious depression, it's a mild form of depression. What AWARE says is that a young man is depressed and he goes on a binge drinking session. Right? Now, binge drinking is different. Alcohol is a contributory factor, but it is not causal. In other words, drinking alcohol will not make you suicidal. If it was, I guarantee you there would be very few of us in this room at the moment, right? But it is a contributory factor, and binge drinking is drinking a lot of alcohol within a short period, or drinking steadily over a number of days. And it's been established that females have a lower tolerance than males. So the women cannot outdrink the men. Physically, men are better able to do it, to handle it, than females. The next point is that he may become disinhibited enough to act suicidally. So if a person has a predisposition towards depression, and then he gets tanked up, he drinks a lot, then the alcohol will deepen the depression. And if there is then a critical incident, and I will give you an example, one that I was aware of, where a man went to work in the morning, he arrived in at the job, drove his car in, and found out that his company had closed. He was out of a job. He went to the pub, and while he was in the pub drinking, he realized, how am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to support my family? What am I going to do? And by the time he got to point number 7, he had a plan. The plan was very simple. I have a large life insurance policy. So he drove his car to the bridge, stopped the car in the middle of the bridge, and jumped over. The trouble is that a lot of people don't realize that the start of a bridge isn't over water. Very often it's the center of the bridge. And when he jumped over, he actually landed in the mud. And he did some serious damage to his spine, but he survived. And when he survived, the first thing his wife said to him was that she didn't give a damn about whether or not they had a job. But his thinking had been, he had a plan as such. So this is the type of thing that happens. Persons doesn't remain suicidal, and we say that alcohol is the key that unlocks the depression cage. So as you see here, the people are inside the cage, and the lions are outside. And alcohol unlocks the key. This is Vincent van Gogh, for those of you who don't recognize the painting. Dr. Tony Bates is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and a very successful one. And he makes the point that people who are suicidal are in pain. It's mental pain. It's just as debilitating as physical pain. But they want to end their pain, not their lives. And their thinking is that, as far as they're concerned, the only way they can see of ending their pain is to end their life. But the suicide itself is not the end aim. The end aim is to end the pain. And because of this, there is an ambiguity. Dr. John Connolly is one of Ireland's leading clinical psychiatrists, and it's not me, and there is no family relationship. But Dr. Connolly says this, that if a person survives the first attempt, that they have more than 80% chance of going on to live a long, productive life. The trick is to survive that first attempt. And males, as I said, because they choose violent means, don't do so. This is Golden Gate Bridge, one of the beauty spots in the world, but also one of the world famous suicide spots. And this is a quotation from Ken Baldwin, who was one of the few people to survive a jump. And the key thing is what Ken says here, that having jumped, as he was jumping, he said, the only thing in my life that was unfixable was the fact that I had just jumped. As his hands left the bar, he had a reassessment of his life. He survived it. He was lucky. Most people don't. So the question, is rescue possible? And the answer basically is yes, it is. As I said, the majority of those who particularly choose suicide as the method, because of cold injury, they're incapable. Once they start to drown, they change their mind. Or once they succumb to cold injury, they're incapable of resisting, but most people don't resist. So the answer to the question, is rescue possible? Yes. In our 2013 conference, I made a long presentation using examples from police reports, from fire reports of the rescue of suicidal casualties, and none of them resisted. Let me remind you again of these common features that apply to suicides by drowning. And remember that they're at night, so all of these things, most of these things are happening in the dark. So particularly in relation to eyewitnesses, when eyewitnesses say, I saw this, this is exactly what happened, they are likely to have been drinking. It's in the dark. The person has jumped into the middle of a river, so there are problems. Now, here are some brief examples of police reports. And in this one, the police officer saw the woman jump in. So there was no question that she had deliberately jumped in. But after she had submerged a number of times, she changed her mind and she did not resist being rescued. Here's a fire one, where the fire crew threw him a number of life vests, but he was not able to reach them. And I refer back to the point about the incidents taking place at night. And a confusion in observers where they basically say he would not accept the ring buy that was being offered, where the reality of it is that we know from rescues of accidental casualties, he was incapable of doing so. And here's a similar one, again a fire report, where he said, we tried to throw the life buoy to her, but the current took it. She was struggling so much she couldn't get it. So it wasn't, I don't want to be rescued. It's just an inability to help themselves when they were doing so. When they start to drown, they quickly lose the ability to self-help. Cold shock. This is a quote from a rescuer. This is a rescuer, and this is what the rescuer said, right? Upon entry to the cold water, my lungs and my head felt like they were about to split open with the cold, and I swallowed water with the shock of it. This was the rescuer before the rescue started. So this also happens to the casualty. And as you know, I believe there is an exit problem. And this is just one example. And I use this one because it's a police officer in the water with other police officers trying to assist him, but they can't get him out of the water. And he has to wait in the water supporting this casualty for 15 minutes until the fire brigade come to help. This is Dublin Fire Brigade, who are recipients of the Ireland Medal, because in Ireland and in many places around the world now, firefighters rescue more people from drowning than any other rescue service if you exclude lifeguards. An Irish success story. I said Ireland has a problem, but also we have many solutions. And this is Fire Search and Rescue, and I'm not going to read it basically because you can read it yourselves. But in Derry, there were between 25 and 30 drownings annually. It's now less than 5. But this shows two things. Fire Search and Rescue are among one of the best suicide prevention and rescue agencies in the world. And yet you cannot prevent everybody from doing so, but you can make a big difference. And in conclusion, the majority of suicides can change their minds, and many do. They want to end their pain, not their lives. And over 80% of those who survive can live long lives. Now, this is the end of the report from drowning, but recently very recently, the World Health Organization published a global report on suicide, and it's called Preventing Suicide. And I'm going to briefly go through it, but because I'm assuming you're going to watch this on DVD, I'm going to put some slides up and quickly go through them. If you're watching it on DVD, you can simply pause the DVD. In this report, the WHO has downgraded its figures from 1 million plus to 803,900, but these are reported, officially declared suicides. And you will note that this is high-income countries in the bottom, and on the top is low and middle-income countries. So therefore, the majority of suicides take place in the poorer parts of the world. The majority of drownings take place in the poorer parts of the world. So there's no surprise that the majority of suicide by drownings take place in LM and ICs. And there are points, is a summary of points being made in the report that suicides are preventable. Every 40 seconds a person dies by suicide. They occur in all regions of the world, through, if you exclude young children under the age of 10, through all of the life span, and 15 to 29-year-olds. Among 15 to 29-year-olds, it's the second leading cause of death globally. I believe number one are road traffic accidents. To mind this one here, I just put it in so that you can pause and read it, but I'm going to show you the key aspects because it reinforces what was in the drowning report. One is that it's very likely that suicides are underreported and that very often suicides are misclassified. In richer countries, 3 times as many men die of suicide than women. But in low and middle income countries, it's almost the same. It's a 3-to-1 in HIC countries and 3-to-2 male to female in LMIC countries. Again, risk factors, and here are the risk factors. A previous suicide attempt. If a person has survived a suicide attempt, normally in the first year, they're very vulnerable. They have a mental disorder, but they are not mentally ill. Right? It's normally depression. They are using or abusing alcohol and possibly drugs. They have either lost a job, or they have some financial problems, or they have marital problems. They express a feeling of hopelessness. They're suffering from chronic pain or some chronic illness, and there's a family history of suicide. In this one, it basically, what is the protection? And it's clearly established that close family and social relationships is the best protection against suicide, and women are more likely to talk about it amongst themselves than men are. And then finally, these are sort of the myths that the WHO says. People who talk about suicide are not really planning to do it. And they say a person talking about suicide may be reaching out, maybe initiating a discussion, and it's okay to talk about it. Another myth is that most suicides happen suddenly, and they state basically that there are usually many warning signs, but often it's only afterwards that it's determined that there actually were warning signs. What's this one here? I can't see it. Someone who is suicidal is determined to die, and we've answered this one already. Suicidal people often change their mind. In this one, once someone is suicidal, they're always suicidal. Well, suicide risk is short term. And this one, only people with mental disabilities, in other words, people who attempt suicide are seriously ill. Mental illness is not causal in itself. In other words, that if someone is mentally ill, they may not be suicidal, but some people are permanently suicidal. But the majority of people are not. And then talking about suicide will only encourage people, and it basically says it's okay to talk about suicide. And that's the end of my report tonight. Thank you very much.